Well, hey everybody, I'm Nick Pettit. My Twitter handle is @NickRP, and this is a live Q&A session about web design, so you can go ahead and ask me any question about web design, web development, careers in the web industry, or whatever else is on your mind. So, we already have our first question here. Rodrigo asks, is there any CSS framework that uses EMS in media queries? I'm sure the answer to this is yes. That's probably the simple answer. But we can go ahead and look and see what a popular framework does. So if we head over to Bootstrap here, and we can go ahead and download Bootstrap, unzip it, and dig into the CSS. So we'll go ahead and open that up in Sublime Text. Oh, looks like it already was open there. I'll go ahead and search for, let's see, M. And it looks like it's being used in a couple of places. So it's being used for some positioning, some padding. It looks like there was an H1 there that already had it being used for like I guess some font size adjustment. But I'm assuming that the question that Rodrigo is asking is related to resizing text in media queries. So I'm looking here, I don't see it used in that way, and it's also not actually used to describe the minimum and maximum widths for the media queries either. That is typically described in pixels because that's the way that you want to try to define your breakpoints in media queries is by using pixels. If you were to use EMS, you might get some actually pretty strange results. I'm not actually sure what would happen. I guess it would kind of adjust as you're resizing the browser, but not in the same ways that you would expect with pixels. So, next question is, what is the advantage in learning Python if you already know PHP? Well, there's a ton of advantages to diversifying the languages that you know. So Python and PHP are both back-end languages, at least typically, and that allows you to interact with the database. You can do all sorts of back-end business logic and basically create front-end code that's then delivered to the client side. So you generate your HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and you can go ahead and deliver that to the client in general. That's kind of back-end, front-end programming in a nutshell. PHP is really great if you're just getting started and you have no back-end programming experience whatsoever. PHP is really easy to get into just because the environment is typically a little bit easier to set up than for something like Ruby on Rails, for example. I'm actually less familiar with Python, but Python and its framework, Django, is a little bit more, I guess, comparable to Ruby on Rails in that it's a more robust web app framework. And in PHP, you do have those. You have those with things like Cake PHP and a couple of others. But the really, really popular ones for, I guess, building web apps are Django and Rails. So if you've done a little bit of PHP and you're ready to move into something more advanced, Django might be a really good option. But knowing as many languages as possible is always going to be your best bet because once you learn one language, it's really easy to pick up other languages. So how's that for a non-answer? So the next question is, David asks, do you use browser feature detection when creating websites? It depends. So I typically do not. I try to just build my sites so that they can be progressively enhanced or gracefully degrade, whichever term you prefer. They're similar terms. It basically just means that you have some sort of fallback plan for browsers that don't support particular features. And if you want to use feature detection You can. It's a perfectly legitimate way to go. In fact, in CSS, there's a new rule that's being introduced pretty soon. I believe it's at supports. I'm actually going to Google that real quick to see if that is on the way. Because I know, yeah, David Walsh was blogging about that. So this is interesting. It is on the Mozilla Developer Network. I'm going to go ahead and see if supports. Actually, I'm going to go to caniuse.com and see where supports is at. Yeah, so CSS feature queries. Doesn't look like it's supported in Internet Explorer, even in version 11. That's not terribly surprising. But looks like Firefox and Chrome support it, so that's actually interesting. I actually have not used supports a whole lot. I didn't know that both Firefox and Chrome supported it at this point. Looks like Safari's still lagging behind, though, so that might make you not want to use it at this point. But that's just another way of doing feature detection just for CSS. You could also do feature detection in JavaScript, and that's just basically testing whether or not something is actually available for you to use in the browser. So next question is Carlos asks, what is the best way to create and use responsive and retina-ready images? So that's a really great question because the answer is kind of in flux. And I guess in short, the answer would be it depends. It depends on what kind of site you're trying to build, how many images maybe you really want to load up. So there's a simple answer and a complex answer. The complex answer is to use basically a tool that will go ahead and swap out your image sources. So I'll take a look at those in just a second. The simpler answer is to actually create just one retina-sized image and not bother switching over to a smaller image if the screen isn't a retina display, or I guess a high-resolution display, if you will. Retina-ready images actually tend to compress really well. You can get away with a lot more JPEG compression on larger images than you can on smaller images. So for example, if you had a photograph at 2x resolution, you could probably get away with setting the compression in Photoshop and Save for Web to like 20 or 30%, which sounds really low, but once you set that and it gets resized for retina displays and it gets rescaled in the browser, even if the device isn't a high-res display, it will still look really good. All of those compression artifacts will kind of just shrink away. And in some cases, the larger image, when it's heavily compressed, actually ends up with a smaller file size than a smaller image with less compression. So hopefully that made sense. And in most cases, you can really just get away with having just the retina-sized image or just the 2x image and just putting a lot of compression on it. So that's the simple answer. The more complex answer is to use some sort of framework, I guess, if you will, to go ahead and swap out your image sources. So there's a couple. I think, is it adaptive images that I'm thinking of? Yeah, so this will actually go ahead and swap them out using a PHP file. So adaptive images is one option. I think, let's see, responsive images. Trying to think what this other project is called. Can't think of the name of it. But there's another one. There's Zurb Interchange from Zurb Foundation. So let's type in interchange here. So this was actually for Foundation 4. I believe Foundation 5 just came out, and I haven't taken a look at it yet, but I would assume that interchange is still a part of that. And interchange, again, is just another option for swapping out your image sources. And this is nice because not only can you swap them out for resolution reasons, or I guess for DPI reasons. So, for example, you could swap image sources from a retina image to a non-retina image. But you can also swap image sources if you want maybe slightly different cropping on a smaller display. I'm trying to think what that other project was. Let me just go ahead and Google this real quick. So, because I blogged about this recently, and I might be able to find it here. Let's see. I think it's SVG first is the title of the blog post. I can't quite find it. Ah, there it is. It was called Scalable Web Design. I know the link is in here somewhere. This is actually a blog post where I talk about how it's good to use SVGs first, if at all possible. Aha, okay. There it is. I Googled responsive images, but I couldn't find it. So responsiveimages.org is the Responsive Images community group, and this is just yet another way to go ahead and swap out your image sources. They're kind of pushing for the picture element, which would make swapping image sources pretty easy, but here they have a really great example of what you can do when you swap out image sources on different devices. So on a large display, you might want to show just the entire picture, but if there was a focal point in the image, and in this case it's this dog here, they want to go ahead and zoom in to the most important part of the image, because if you had this very large image and it was shrunken down to this portrait view on this phone, it would be a little bit difficult to really see all the detail there that you'd want to see. So anyway, those are a couple of options. I'm sure that's probably more complex of an answer than you were hoping for, but that's just the truth. There's really no simple answer to creating retina-ready images. What's your opinion on SVGs? I'm having problems with cross-browser compatibility. Well, it depends on what browsers you're trying to support, but SVGs are pretty well supported at this point. So I have Can I Use here up. That's at caniuse.com. And SVGs are currently supported with basic support all the way back to Internet Explorer 9. So that's 2 versions back now. So you should be actually fairly safe to go ahead and start using SVGs as long as you provide some sort of image fallback. So they're also supported in Firefox, Chrome, and Safari, and pretty well supported across all mobile browsers. You can go ahead and use SVGs in the image element, so that's actually using them as the source for your image. You can also use SVGs in CSS backgrounds, and that for some time was a little bit less supported, but it looks like support is pretty good at this point. You can also do SVGs inline, and something that's a little bit newer are SVG filters. So that's described as using Photoshop-like effects on SVG objects. So you can go ahead and do things like blurring or color manipulation and all sorts of other cool effects. That is still a bit less supported, and it's also pretty computationally intensive, so it's something that you don't want to use in abundance. But it looks like support is coming pretty soon here, so that's good. But if you do need to support Internet Explorer 8 and back, you will need some sort of fallback. So again, in this same article, Scalable Web Design, I talk about using vectors first, and you can go ahead and create a bitmap-based fallback. And there's actually a really great tool that does that. It's called GrumpIcon or GrumpIcon or GrumpIcon. I'm not really sure how you pronounce it. But you can go ahead and drag and drop an SVG right here. And it will go ahead and create a bitmap-based fallback for you. So that's a really good solution if you need to support browsers that don't necessarily support SVGs as well as you'd like. So hopefully that answers your question. Next question says, I'm just getting started at Treehouse and building websites. Awesome. But I'm still having trouble grasping the basics. I was recommended starting with Bootstrap. Any other suggestions? So it depends what you're trying to accomplish. If you're still really, really new to web design, I'd recommend going onto Treehouse and just learning about HTML and CSS. You've probably started with the project How to Build a Simple Website, where we actually build this website called Smells Like Bacon. You can see a sample of it at smellslikebacon.com. And it's just a simple website for a bakery. And we do use a simple grid system, but we don't use a full-blown framework in this particular project. If you do feel like you have kind of the basics of HTML and CSS down, you may want to go on to using a more robust framework. So the one you mentioned is Bootstrap, which I have up here. And that's what's called a front-end framework. So it's basically going to be a collection of CSS and JavaScript, and you can go ahead and use Bootstrap to build more complex grids rather than using the simple grid system that we introduced in that project. So Bootstrap is very robust and it's used by lots of websites. It's really, really great, and it does make it very easy to get started building grids. There are other options for front-end frameworks though. So this is another one, and it's called Zurb Foundation. Let me pull it up here. Zurb is the company that puts it together. And as I mentioned previously, it's now in version 5, and you'll find a lot of the features in Zurb that you would find in Bootstrap. They're very, very competitive with one another, so one is not necessarily better than the other. It really comes down to personal preference. So if you're still new to web design and you're just starting out and you're ready to start using a framework like this to try and accelerate the pace at which you can build websites, I would go ahead and try using Zurb and try using Bootstrap in 2 separate projects and see which one you like better, because you might find that you have a preference for one over the other. And that's perfectly fine. That's why there's more than one front-end framework. And those are actually just 2. There are 2 major front-end frameworks that are very popular and very feature complete, but there's lots and lots of other front-end frameworks if you feel like these are a little bit too robust for you. You can just go ahead and type in front-end framework into Google and just start searching around a little bit, maybe read some blog posts, and you'll find lots of others that you can go ahead and test out. So next question is from Rodrigo, and he says, is an Internet Explorer 8 fallback still needed? Well, that depends on the audience for your site. If you are looking in your Google Analytics for the site, and you're noticing you're getting a lot of Internet Explorer 8 traffic, then yeah, you probably still need to support Internet Explorer 8 to some degree or another. If you look there and you see that your site really isn't getting a lot of traffic from IE8, then you're probably okay. If it's down to like 1 or 2%, that's probably the point where you can start cutting off support, or at least not offering support for some of the more advanced features that require a newer browser. So let's just go ahead and look up browser market share, because you can usually get a pretty good idea of some usage statistics here. So let's see. If we're looking at, I'm actually looking for a particular version of IE. I'm not sure if this table offers that. This Wikipedia article actually uses a variety of sources for their statistics on browser market share, but this isn't what I'm looking for. Let's see. Let's go ahead and go back and see if we can find net applications, because I usually have a pretty good, yeah. Is this it? Net market share? I'm not sure. We're going on an adventure here together. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I would just look at the usage stats for IE8. You can usually find it pretty easily by Googling, a little bit more easily than that. But also make a decision based on your audience. That's really the most important thing, because if nobody's visiting your site that's using IE8, then in your case, it doesn't really matter. So, something to think about. Next question says, do you have any good recommendations for or resources for blog post templates? Not really. I'm actually not too much of a WordPress guru. I've used WordPress quite a lot in the past, but I'm definitely not an expert. WordPress goes pretty deep. But for blog post templates, I mean, when I think of blog post templates, I think of, WordPress themes. So if you're using WordPress, that would definitely be the place to look. You would want to go for, you'd want to just type into Google like WordPress themes, and you'll find tons and tons of themes that are both free and paid themes as well. And it's definitely a case where you're going to get what you pay for the most part. There's plenty of really great free themes, but some of the paid ones are pretty nice, and there's a reason that they're paid. It's because the people that made them put a lot of work into them. So I don't have any great recommendations or resources in that regard, but our WordPress teacher, Zach, at Treehouse definitely would. So if you're a Treehouse member, you might want to hit up Zach in the forum and ask him if he has any good recommendations. So next question says, any advice for back-end developers who are interested in web design? Oh, yes. So I have worked with lots of developers in my time. In fact, I've done lots of development myself. I self-identify as a web designer, but that doesn't mean I don't do any development at all. In fact, I do quite a lot. So I have plenty of advice for developers that are looking to break into web design. The number one thing that I see from developers in terms of designing websites is that they tend to kind of ignore the use of space. You can always tell when a layout is designed by a developer because there will be text that's like running right up against the edge of the site or another element. There just won't really be enough space between all the elements on the page because it can be, if you're newer to design, it can be a little bit strange to actually include a lot of space because it feels like you're literally adding nothing to the page. But space is important because when you have negative space between elements, it just makes things a lot easier to read and navigate. So I actually wrote a blog post about this as well. And I'm going to go ahead and search here. I think it's called 5 Mistakes Web Developers Make, or something like that. Let's see. Or it's like 5 things every developer should know. 5 design tips every developer should know. So, I just went over the first one, use negative space. So just make sure that there's enough space between your elements. And there's a bunch of more detailed tips about that there. You also need to pay attention to contrast, and you want to create contrast through value or lightness and darkness. You don't want to create contrast through color too much. You actually really want to rely on the lightness and darkness of a color before you rely on color itself. So a really great way to test that is to put your page in black and white and just look at it, in grayscale and see if you notice any areas that are too light or too dark or aren't really contrasting with one another enough, because by removing all color, you'll see areas that are not contrasting through value, but might be contrasting through color, and they're just hidden as a result. There's a couple more here. Yeah, add variety with texture, although flat design is all the rage right now, so maybe that's not such a great tip anymore. I can't really tell these days. You want to try to communicate using shape. So websites are really great for creating rectangles, but it can be difficult to create non-rectangular shapes. Fortunately, it is actually a little easier these days with CSS3 because you can go ahead and create really nice shapes using things like border radius or pseudo elements and a couple of other things. So this is a list of shapes on CSS Tricks, and it's linked here in this article. And all of these shapes are created with a single HTML element. So it's pretty incredible, some of the shapes that you can make, and you can do a lot to draw attention to an element just by changing its shape slightly. And the last one is just to make sure that you have really good balance on the page. So you don't want elements to be too heavy on one side and too light on another, or vice versa. And a good way to check that is to flip your page upside down. So you could go ahead and take a screenshot of it and flip it upside down in an image editor, or you could actually go ahead and use CSS3 and just rotate the entire body of the page. You could do that in like the developer tools, for example, in Google Chrome or Firefox or a lot of other browsers. So you could go ahead and flip your page upside down, and that way you'll be able to look at the composition of the page and kind of judge, okay, without looking at the text or other elements that seem familiar, does the page feel heavier on one side or the other? So that's a really good way to check balance. Hopefully that answered your question. So next question says, how do you handle image sizing when dealing with 2x images in your CSS? There's a couple of different ways. Generally, you want to have your images, at 2 times the resolution that you would need them to be at. If it is a background image, you need to set the background size to 50%. I think that's correct. My math might be slightly off on that. Or it's like the other way. I'm not sure. But in general, I think you need to set them to 50% in order to size them down. You also can set an explicit width on images, or on elements that are the container for images. So if you know that the container is going to be a certain size, you just need to set the image to be 2x that size when you're actually creating it, so that when you drop it in, it's resized by the browser. But that is the general rule, is that you want to create 2x images, you need them to be at 2 times the resolution, and then they're resized in the browser. So next question is from Kevin. He asks, for a large website project, would you recommend starting with Bootstrap, Foundation, or neither? Well, we kind of already answered this previously. You should use whatever CSS framework, front-end framework you feel most comfortable with, and you should try out a couple different ones to see which matches your personal preferences. However, the second part of the question, or neither, I would definitely use a front-end framework every time. I wouldn't go into a huge web project without some sort of framework there, because you're just going to have such a much easier time developing new features rapidly if you have a framework already in place. unless it's some sort of legacy project that developed CSS over time and really just kind of works and you don't want to mess with it. If you're starting a new project, you should really try to seek out a front-end framework that you think is going to work great for that particular project and for your own personal preferences or the preferences of your team. So in terms of Bootstrap and Foundation or any other though, you should just try it out and see which one you like. Next question is from Andy. He asks, what's the best approach for creating an app that allows others to build their own custom mobile apps? For example, a business that wants to be able to brand and customize an app for each of their clients. That's getting a little bit more specific than I think I'm able to answer here. I'd have to kind of see the project and see the code and stuff. But in general, I think you want to focus on the areas that are going to be different for each client and then try to standardize the parts that are going to be the same, right? So if you know that, for example, the logo is going to need to change for each client, obviously that's something that you're going to want to include as maybe an image upload. So if you're building out, say, the customization for the app, you really just want to have it all in one nice, neat form that kind of shows what parts are going to be different. So they can upload their logo, they can upload their tagline, they can upload their bio, all that kind of stuff. For building actual functionality into applications that differs from one app to another, that's a pretty complex project, and it's kind of hard to make a recommendation without more specifics. But hopefully that answers your question, at least partially. Next question is from Kay. They ask, what is your web design process for a medium-sized project? That's interesting. So for a medium to large size project, or I guess medium and up, we'll say, I'm always going to use a framework like Bootstrap or Foundation. I personally like Bootstrap better. Doesn't mean that it's better than Foundation or vice versa. I'm always going to use a framework every time. And in terms of design process, I usually will start with wireframing. So I'll start some sort of paper mockup, or I'll do wireframes in a wireframing tool like Balsamiq Mockups. And from there, I'll try to iterate on those a couple of times. I'm really a big fan of iterating and not just going with the first idea that pops into my head. So when I'm designing a page, I'll list out all the things that I know need to be somewhere on the page, and then I'll start placing and laying out the elements in terms of shapes, so I'll kind of block out the different areas. After that, it really depends, but for a medium project, I'll probably skip the Photoshop mockup, and I'll even do this for larger projects. I'll just kind of go straight into the HTML and CSS. Unless there's just really specific parts that I know need to be fleshed out in more detail and are going to need some really fine-tuning, I guess you could say, then I'll go ahead and go into Photoshop. But otherwise, I'll try to skip Photoshop when I can. So for a medium project, I'm probably not going to do any kind of mock-up in Photoshop or in Illustrator or some other tool. For really small projects, I will sometimes not use a framework. If I know it's just going to be one page and it's going to be really simple, I'll just go with a simple CSS reset and just kind of hand code it from there. But for a medium project, yeah, definitely going to use a framework, and every time I'm going to use some sort of wireframing and mockup tool. I think that's really essential. So next question says, what kind of projects would AngularJS be a good fit for? So that's a good question. Let's go ahead and type in AngularJS so that for those of you that aren't familiar, you can go ahead and take a look at this. AngularJS is basically a front-end framework, and it says, why AngularJS, or what is it? Basically, HTML is great for declaring static documents, but AngularJS allows you to create dynamic views on top of that HTML. It says AngularJS lets you extend HTML vocabulary for your application. Now, I have not used AngularJS extensively, but basically it allows you to drop in little things like this. So it says hello and then your name with two curly braces surrounding either side. And if you're familiar with PHP or Ruby or Python, all of those languages do the same thing, but they do it on the back end. This is done on the front end, so it's actually talking to the database and then dropping in that information after the HTML is loaded. So the HTML loads up, talks to the database, drops in all of the information, and it's just basically a way of creating dynamic view templates. What kind of projects would it be a good fit for? Any kind of web application where you need dynamic views, which is pretty much almost every web application. Internally, and our founder and CEO, Ryan Carson, has blogged about this, we use a custom-built app, and we use AngularJS with it. And it's basically like a clone of Reddit, where we can kind of upvote and downvote different posts, and we can have threaded discussions. And we use AngularJS to populate those views, and it's worked out great for us. It's kind of a medium-sized project at this point, but Angular has been great. So I guess that's at least one specific example. Next question says, do you have any advice for someone looking for a web design job right out of college? I'll be graduating in May with a marketing degree, but I've been learning web design with Treehouse. Well, that's awesome. I'm so glad that you're learning with Treehouse. I realized at the beginning I actually did not talk about Treehouse. Treehouse, if you're not familiar, is a website where you can learn web design, web development, business, mobile, and so much other stuff. It's really awesome. You can check us out at teamtreehouse.com here. Here's our beautiful homepage. We recently redesigned the site. It's really awesome. If you go ahead and click the Get Started button, you can drop into our library here and kind of get an idea of what the site is like. So there's a bunch of topics you can choose from here, and it's really, really cool. There's a ton of stuff to explore. We have really awesome forums where people are very, very helpful. It's great. Anyway, that's the 5-second view of what Treehouse is. So I'm glad you're learning with us. But to your question, do I have any advice for somebody right out of college if you want to go into web design? Well, I think it's great that you studied marketing. That's going to be a really big help in any kind of web design career, because a lot of web design is just getting your voice heard. I mean, the internet is really kind of like a megaphone for your ideas in a way, and it's also a really great way to interact and communicate with people. So it's this incredible mixed medium, and it's very interdisciplinary. So there's room for lots of other types of expertise besides just web design. So marketing will definitely be applicable there, because once you create, the next great iPhone app or web app or whatever it might be, you're going to have to market it. So that's really important. If you're just getting started though, and let's say you're trying to do freelance and you're trying to build a portfolio, or even if you're trying to get a job, you're still going to need a portfolio. And a great way to build that up is to just do really small projects that maybe you get paid a small amount for, or even do stuff for free. So how do you find people that need websites? Well, there's lots of ways. Really, the best way is to just reach out to people in your community. So for example, if there's a farmer's market nearby where you live, you might want to go there and talk to a couple of the small vendors and ask them like, hey, do you have a website? And maybe they do, maybe they don't. If they do, maybe you can try to improve their website, because a lot of small businesses don't really have the resources or the know-how to do really awesome websites. So if that's something that you can contribute to them, I mean, that's awesome, and it's a really fast way to build up your portfolio. So that's a good place to look. But once you've built up your portfolio, it's really not too dissimilar from other industries. You want to, of course, apply for jobs in the same way that you might apply for any other job. You can search on job boards and stuff. Treehouse has a job board, so you might want to look there. But you also want to make sure that you're networking within the community. So you want to try to look for web design conferences where you can go ahead and buy tickets and attend and interact with other people that are there. There's also lots of free stuff that you can do. So locally, you might find user groups for whatever type of language or thing that you're interested in. So there might be a Ruby or a PHP users group or a JavaScript users group. There could be like a web design group that meets up for coffee every Wednesday morning or something like that. So try to look around in your local community and network, because oftentimes that's also what leads to a job. Somebody knows somebody else that has an opening at their company, and you can go ahead and network that way. So it's actually pretty lo-fi the way that you'd apply for a job in the web industry. Just like, a lot of other industries, just takes hustle. So let's see, I actually lost my place here. Oh, okay. Next question says, which do you prefer, responsive design or separate mobile site? Oh, that's such a good question. I am going to make a responsive site like 99 times out of 100. I find responsive sites to be so much easier to manage because you're only dealing with one code base. Granted, it is slightly more complicated. It's still going to probably be easier in the long run to maintain a single code base rather than having to sync up a mobile site with a desktop site and have one-to-one feature parity and design parity with both of them. Because, that's difficult enough as it is if, say, you have like a native application and a web app. You don't want to create additional headaches for yourself by creating two different versions of your web app when it can be the same. The only instance in which you might want to create a separate mobile site is, it's hard to even think of one anymore, but if you have a very specific mobile experience that you want to target, or you have a very well established website that's already built out and it looks great, it just needs a mobile experience, then you might want to go ahead and build a separate mobile web app. But that kind of thing is becoming more and more rare as time goes on. It's really difficult to find a site that has a great desktop site and no mobile site whatsoever. So that's kind of a rarity. But yeah, I recommend going with responsive. I think it's just going to be a lot easier in the long run, unless you have a really specific use case for the mobile app. Next question says, what's your favorite source of inspiration as a web designer? It just comes from all over, really. I know that's a very vague answer, but I find inspiration in movies and in video games and just by walking outside in nature. I love to look at fine art. I find that a lot of fine art techniques kind of tend to get lost in the realm of web design because it's so much more technically oriented with computer code. But there's a lot that we can learn from fine art and art history that can be drawn upon as a great source of inspiration. So I do personally like to look there a lot. There's plenty of other places to look. I know I've been referring to my own blog posts a lot here, but I did just recently blog about this as well. And it's a blog post called How to Break a Creative Block. And in there I talk about a couple of sources of inspiration. You can look at Dribbble or Pinterest. And there's lots of other sites like it. Those are just two popular ones. There's also Behance and Forest I mentioned later on there. But one thing that I like to do on Dribbble is go to an artist that I like. So I'm just looking at the front page here, popular. Let's say that I look at this and I say, oh, wow, that's really cool. I'll go ahead and click on the artist's name, and then I click on who they're following. And from there, I can go ahead and look and see like, where did the source of their inspiration come from? And usually you can trace things back to something that looks similar to the stuff that you really like that they're producing. And in that way, you can start to find, I guess, real sources of creativity. It's hard to have an original idea anymore, but it's totally fine to be inspired by other stuff, and that's where most artists go to. They go to inspiration and other artists. So next question, and I think we're starting to get close to the end here. I can do a couple more. We usually run for about an hour here, and we're 47 minutes in. But next question says, with websites like Wix that allow users to make websites with no coding, oh man, do you feel that will lower the value of designer jobs in the future? Yes and no, but mostly no. So yes, there are lots of websites like that now that can go ahead and help maybe those smaller businesses I mentioned earlier create websites without much programming knowledge at all. However, there's always going to be a place for customized web designs, and maybe that will eat into the market a little bit. Maybe a lot of people will see these sites and think like, don't really need to hire a web designer to create this whole website for me. I can just go ahead and do it myself. But even if that does start to happen, that's only going to make a web designer even more valuable because those skills are going to become a little bit more rare. So it'll always be a great profession to be in. The other thing to keep in mind is that there is no shortage of websites to be designed. There's always going to be more stuff. And in fact, there's small businesses, medium, large businesses, and lots and lots and lots of individuals that all need websites. So for the most part, no, I don't think that's really ever going to be a serious problem that web designers are going to face. Next question says, what's a good way to find a mentor in the industry? That's a difficult question to answer because a lot of times people aren't necessarily able to give their time to individuals that really need to learn stuff, so they can't just, spend a couple hours a day with somebody. But, if you're looking for critique, there's plenty of ways to get that. You could go ahead and post stuff on a site like Dribbble or, other critique sites. Forest is really good for getting critique as well. And in that way, you might not have a mentor that's going to teach you one-on-one, but in a way, you'll actually get something that's maybe a little bit better because you'll get the kind of hive mind and community feedback from a lot of people. And in that way, you can start to evolve your own skills. You may also want to check out the Treehouse Forum if you haven't done so already. There's lots of students there that are totally willing to collaborate on projects with one another. So if you're just looking for maybe a project collaborator, that might be a good way. Another good way to learn new skills if you're still really new is to try and find an internship in the web design industry. And those types of positions or, junior developer positions will be really good because you'll be in a real environment where you have to do real stuff. And that's a great trial by fire, if you will, because you're going to learn so much more than you're going to learn just by working on your own projects. So hopefully that answers your question. Let's see. Next question says, is there a way to remove unused CSS selectors from a large front-end framework? Oh my gosh. So yes, there is. There's a couple of different ways that you can do this. Let's see. I think it's called CSS. Yeah. Here we go. Found it on the first try. Awesome. So there is a CSS redundancy analyzer called CSS, and it says here it will parse any CSS files you'll give it, and it will let you know which rule sets have duplicated declarations. So that's pretty cool. If we go on, say, another website here, and we open up the Chrome DevTools, I did that by hitting Command-Option-I on my Mac. It's Control-Shift-I on a PC. You can go ahead and click on the Audits panel and then hit Run. And it should tell you if there are redundant selectors here. This is taking an awful long time to audit. I'm not really sure why. Maybe I can try it on another page here. I apologize to Chris Coyer for running an audit here. Aha, okay. So you can run an audit using the Chrome DevTools, and it will say remove unused CSS rules. And it will give you some classes or CSS rules that are not being used by the current page. So just to caveat that, it's important that you don't meddle with a framework too much. You don't want to remove stuff that you might really need. But if you are looking to make a framework a little bit leaner, most major frameworks have a customization tool. So if you go to Bootstrap here and click on Customize, you can go ahead and check which parts of the framework that you want to include, and you can go ahead and uncheck parts that you don't want to include. So that's one way to also remove CSS. So hopefully that answers your question. Next question says, how do you find balance in learning web design and development when there's so much information out there? Are there specific areas one should focus on? Yes and no. So it can be hard figuring out what's new and what you should be paying attention to, but really the answer is that nobody knows everything, and it's really impossible to try and learn everything. For example, like I said earlier, I haven't really gotten into Python at all. I just haven't had the time or have been interested in other things. It doesn't mean that Python isn't good and that I should try to learn it. I just haven't. So, you just can't learn everything. So always keep that in mind. There's always going to be more stuff to learn, no matter how far you're able to advance your career and your knowledge. But I guess, one thing you can do is watch the Treehouse Show. So not to self-promote even more, but we do a show every week at Treehouse. It's called The Treehouse Show. You can check it out on iTunes or on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/GoTreehouse. And it's just kind of a roundup of links and other cool bits of information about the web industry. And you can go ahead and keep up that way. You're never going to learn everything. So what should you do instead? Well, you should try and focus. A lot of developers will self-identify as a PHP developer or a Ruby developer or maybe a front-end developer where they do a lot of JavaScript work, for example, or a lot of CSS work. So if you can try and pick a little bit more of a narrow focus, maybe you start getting really into front-end, you might want to look at something like Angular and say, okay, I'm really getting good at front-end development. I want to go ahead and specialize even further and learn things like Angular and other front-end frameworks and become really awesome at that. And that's a perfectly okay way to market yourself. You don't have to be an all-around developer that can do absolutely everything. There are some really talented developers out there that can definitely do both front-end and back-end coding. You don't have to do that, though. You can be a really awesome Ruby developer and leave the design work and everything else to other people on a team. So hope that answers your question. We got about 5 more minutes here, so I'm just going to do a couple more. Next question says, what's the best way to make images responsive? I feel like we kind of already talked about that. Next question says, can you explain Grunt and how someone would integrate it into their workflow? So, CSS actually, I think can be used by Grunt or integrated to a Grunt workflow. Yes. So Grunt CSS is a Grunt task to automatically run CSS. But what is Grunt? Well, it is self-described as the JavaScript task runner. And a task runner basically allows you to automate things when you're building your website. So if you have a lot of repetitive tasks, such as running testing, or you need to do minification on your CSS and JavaScript, you can go ahead and build out a tool chain of tasks and go ahead and run those tasks when you're exporting your code for the web. So that's basically what Grunt is. Don't have a whole lot of time here to go into it. I want to kind of wrap up a few more questions here, but that's basically what it is in a nutshell. And there's plenty of great documentation you can go ahead and check out on gruntjs.com. So next question says, what color scheme do you use in Sublime Text? I'm not really sure. Let's go ahead and open up Sublime Text and see. Let's see, preferences, color scheme. Looks like I'm using Mac Classic right now. I have been known to use ZenBurnesque, so I do use this quite a bit. But I try to use Mac Classic when screencasting just because it's a little bit easier to see dark text on a lighter background. How different are web design and web development? It's kind of like a Venn diagram. I mean, there's areas that overlap. There's areas that are definitely classified as development and definitely classified as design. So for example, if you're making wireframes or Photoshop and Illustrator mockups, that's most definitely web design. If you're writing back-end code that interacts with a database, that's definitely web development. I think the area where it gets fuzzy is on the front end with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You know, what is design and what is development? It's kind of hard to say because a designer, I would expect to code CSS, whereas it's perfectly okay for a developer to go ahead and write CSS code as well. It's just kind of it just kind of varies depending on the particular intent. So a designer might be writing CSS to try and make the site look really great and aesthetically pleasing or more clear and create a great user experience. A developer might be writing CSS code because they want to go ahead and maybe optimize something, or there's this new feature that they're building and it doesn't really require a lot of design work. It just needs to show like this new message on the page or something. They might go ahead and write a little bit of CSS to go ahead and include that. JavaScript is another area where it gets a little bit funky. I mean, it's kind of hard to say whether a designer or a developer should be doing that. Yes, it is computer code, so, seems like a developer should be doing that. But a lot of the interactions or animations and other things that you might be creating with JavaScript could be classified as design because it's affecting the overall user experience. Now, the same could be said about the back end. So, for example, if the site is not performant, that's going to affect the user experience. But JavaScript handles that a little bit more directly. So, to answer your question, I mean, it is different, but there's areas where it does get fuzzy. So, our last question is, how often do you find yourself referring to code documentation? I have a hard time remembering all the CSS3 goodies. I refer to documentation all the time. If I had to write out a CSS3 radial gradient for WebKit right now, I couldn't do it. I'd need to look it up. And that's perfectly okay. There's so many HTML elements and CSS properties, you're never going to remember them all. And even if you do, you're never going to remember quite the right syntax for all of them. And if you can, well, then good for you. You're probably a superhuman. It's really, really hard to memorize all that stuff. So don't feel bad if you feel like you need to look stuff up all the time, because all the pros do it. They always look up stuff. They're always referring to documentation, even for functions that they use all the time. If they're programming, they'll go ahead and start to use a function and they'll say, what's that third argument that this method is asking for? They'll go ahead and look it up in the documentation. So don't feel bad about memorizing all the HTML elements, CSS properties. It's really, really difficult to do. Well, that about wraps things up. Thanks so much for sending me so many great questions. Wow, I mean, I'm pretty blown away by the response to this. I'm so glad that so many people participated. It's been really, really fun. Again, I'm Nick Pettit. I am at NickRP on Twitter. If you'd like to learn more about us and check out Treehouse, you can check us out at teamtreehouse.com, which of course is the best way to learn web design, web development, business, mobile, and so much more. Thanks so much for watching. We do these every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, so hopefully I will see you next week.